In March 2017, something remarkable happened in a Florida courtroom. Kendrick Morris walked in hoping for freedom and walked out with something far worse than his original sentence. He got life in prison. And what makes this even more shocking is that he asked for this hearing himself. Today, Morris sits in a Florida prison cell knowing that every single day for the rest of his life will be exactly the same as the one before. No end date, no light at the end of the tunnel, just existence until death. Many people believe life imprisonment is somehow more humane than the death penalty. They say at least you get to live, right? But by the end of this video, I am going to challenge everything you think you know about which punishment is truly worse. And I want you to comment below whether you agree or not after hearing the full story. But first, we need to understand how Kendrick Morris ended up in this nightmare that is worse than death itself. Back in 2008, when Morris was just 16 years old, he committed crimes of extreme violence that even seasoned prosecutors struggled to describe them. He attacked Queen Fu outside a public library in Bloomingdale, Florida. The attack was so vicious that Queen was left blind, paralyzed, and unable to speak. She requires round-the-clock medical care to this very day. Morris was originally sentenced to 65 years in prison in 2011. But here is where things get interesting. Supreme Court rulings changed the game for juvenile offenders. The courts decided that lengthy sentences for people who committed crimes as teenagers were unconstitutional. These young offenders, they said, deserved a chance at parole. So in 2017, Morris and his attorneys went back to court. They rolled the dice. They wanted a reduced sentence, maybe 20 years, maybe 30. They brought in doctors who testified that Morris had changed. He earned his high school diploma in prison. His IQ tested at 114, which is above average. He had an almost clean prison record. The doctors said he could be rehabilitated. Judge Chet Tharp listened to all of this. And then he did something that shocked everyone in that courtroom. Instead of reducing the 65-year sentence, he increased it to life in prison. The judge looked at Morris and essentially said, "You will never walk free. You will die behind bars." Morris's own attempt to get mercy became the thing that sealed his fate forever. Most people hear life sentence and think, okay, he lives out his days in a cell. But the reality is so much darker than that. Let me show you what Morris faces every single day, and you will start to understand why this might actually be worse than a quick execution. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and knowing with absolute certainty that you will spend the next 50 or 60 years in the same small cell. Not as punishment for a month or a year, but for decades. Your entire life stretching ahead of you with no possibility of change. Morris is currently in a Florida maximum security facility. These are not the comfortable prisons you see on TV. Let me paint you the real picture. In maximum security facilities in Florida, inmates like Morris are confined to their cells for up to 23 hours a day. The cells are typically 6 feet by 9 feet. That is about the size of a small bathroom. Now imagine spending 23 hours every single day in your bathroom. For years, for decades, 1 hour. That is all the time Morris gets outside his cell each day. 1 hour to shower, exercise, and try to remember what it feels like to be human. Florida has over 10,000 inmates in some form of solitary confinement or restrictive housing at any given time. The isolation is designed to break you down mentally. And it works. Studies have shown that solitary confinement increases the risk of premature death by 26%. But here is the truly disturbing part. Over 50% of all self-harm related deaths in custody happen in solitary confinement. Let that sink in. When the isolation becomes too much, many inmates experience extreme psychological distress in those conditions. Charles Dickens visited an American prison in the 1800s and said that solitary confinement was immeasurably worse than any extreme physical punishment. He called it a slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain. That was almost 200 years ago. The conditions have not gotten better. Morris has been living this reality since 2011. That is over 14 years now. Every morning he wakes up and faces the same concrete walls, the same metal bars, the same crushing silence. Because at least with the death penalty, there is an end date. There is a moment when the suffering stops. But for Morris, there is no end in sight. This is the key difference between life imprisonment and the death penalty. Death row inmates at least have a timeline. They know their suffering has an expiration date. It might be months or years away, but it exists. Morris has no such comfort. He faces what psychologists call temporal death. His future has been completely erased. There is no 5-year plan, no dreams of retirement, no hope of holding his children or grandchildren, just an endless present that stretches into infinity. Research shows that the complete absence of hope causes more psychological damage than almost anything else. It leads to something called learned helplessness, where a person gives up entirely because they see no point in trying to improve their situation. Morris is now in his early 30s. If he lives to 75 or 80, he has 40 to 50 more years of this ahead of him. That is 14,600 to 18,250 days of waking up in the same cell, of eating the same tasteless food, of hearing the same clanging bars and shouted orders. Try to imagine that. Try to imagine 40 more years of your life spent in a bathroom-sized cell with 1 hour of freedom per day. But the physical conditions are only part of the torture. The real hell is the complete separation from normal human existence. Morris has a family. He had a life before prison, but that world is completely cut off from him now. His family members can visit, but visits in maximum security facilities are heavily restricted. They happen through glass partitions. No physical contact, no hugs, no human touch. Humans are social creatures. We need connection. We need touch. We need to feel like we belong to something larger than ourselves. Prison strips all of that away. Former inmates who spent years in solitary confinement have described it as living death. One man said after 18 years in isolation, he could no longer remember how to have a normal conversation. Simple tasks like using a smartphone or ordering food at a restaurant became overwhelming. The person Morris was at 16 is gone. The person he is now is fundamentally broken by years of isolation and sensory deprivation. And he still has decades more of this ahead of him. Morris has a sentencing review scheduled for 2031. That is just 6 years away from today in December 2025. But will that review actually change anything? In 2017, when Judge Tharp sentenced Morris to life, he included one provision. Morris would be eligible for a sentencing review in 2031. That is 20 years after his original 2011 sentencing. On paper, this sounds like hope, a chance for release, a light at the end of the tunnel. But the reality is much darker. Legal experts say that based on the heinous nature of Morris's crimes, it is highly unlikely he will ever be released. Judge Tharp made it clear in court that he believed Morris should never walk free. So Morris has been living for years with this tiny flicker of hope. 2031. Maybe 2031. And when that year arrives and the review panel looks at his case and denies his release, what then? He will have to face the reality that he truly will die in prison. That the hope he has been clinging to for 20 years was an illusion. Psychologists call this kind of false hope one of the cruelest forms of psychological torture. It is almost better to have no hope at all than to have hope constantly dangled in front of you and then ripped away. Now, before anyone thinks I am saying Morris deserves sympathy, let me be absolutely clear. What he did to Queen Afu was monstrous. She lives every day unable to see, walk, or speak. Her sister Anna Donato said Queena received a life sentence too. And she is absolutely right. Queena needs 24-hour medical care. She expresses herself only through facial expressions and sounds. She lost her entire future in that attack. When Morris was resentenced, Anna Donato stood in court and said justice was served, but she also said something profound. She said both lives are now sentenced to life, and it is such a sad and unfortunate situation for everybody involved. That is the truth of it. 2 lives destroyed. 1 victim suffering every day. 1 perpetrator suffering in a different way. The question is not whether Morris deserves punishment. He absolutely does. The question is whether this particular form of punishment is actually more humane than the alternative. Which is truly worse? A quick death or 50 years of living hell? The death penalty has become increasingly controversial in America. Many states have abolished it. The arguments against it are strong. Wrongful convictions, racial bias in sentencing, the irreversibility of execution. But when we talk about humane punishment, we rarely ask the people who actually face these sentences. If you gave death row inmates the choice between execution and life without parole in maximum security, what would they choose? Some studies suggest that many would actually choose execution, because the psychological torture of endless confinement is in many ways worse than death. Think about it this way. With execution, you experience fear and pain for hours or maybe days. Then it is over. With life imprisonment, you experience despair, isolation, and hopelessness for decades. One is acute suffering. The other is chronic suffering that never ends. Morris will likely spend 40 or 50 more years in his cell. During that time, he will watch himself age. He will watch his family members grow old and die. He will miss every birthday, every holiday, every milestone. He will never feel grass under his feet or sunshine on his face without shackles and guards surrounding him. And the whole time he will know that this will never end, that he will die in that cell. Florida has more people serving life without parole than almost any other state. The state leads the country with nearly 1/4 of the nation's life without parole prisoners. That is more than California and New York combined. The state's prison system is notoriously harsh. Reports of abuse, neglect, and inhumane conditions are common. Overcrowding is a major problem. Violence between inmates is frequent. Florida also uses solitary confinement more than most states. Roughly 1 in 8 Florida prisoners are in some form of isolation. And the demographics are telling. Young black men with mental health issues are disproportionately placed in long-term isolation. The conditions in these facilities have been challenged in court multiple times. The U.S. Department of Justice has investigated Florida prisons for civil rights violations. Former inmates described the system as designed not to rehabilitate but to warehouse human beings until they die. This is the system where Morris will spend the rest of his life. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, punishment, and mercy. Is the purpose of prison to rehabilitate offenders? Clearly not in Morris's case. The doctor said he could be rehabilitated, but the judge disagreed. Is the purpose to protect society? Morris is locked away. Society is protected. But at what cost? Is the purpose to punish? If so, Morris's punishment is arguably more severe than death. He is being forced to endure decades of psychological and physical suffering. Or is the purpose revenge? To make the perpetrator suffer as much as possible? These are not easy questions. And reasonable people can disagree on the answers. But what we cannot ignore is the reality that life without parole in maximum security is not some mercy. It is not the humane alternative to execution. It is a different kind of death sentence. One that is drawn out over decades. If you were in Morris's shoes and you had to choose between a life sentence in maximum security or execution, what would you choose? Really think about it. 40 to 50 years in a 6x9 cell. 23 hours a day of isolation. No hope of release, or a comparatively quick death. The uncomfortable truth is that many people, when faced with that choice, would choose death. Because living without hope, living without purpose, living in complete isolation from everything that makes us human is not really living at all. Some philosophers argue that life imprisonment without parole is actually crueler than the death penalty precisely because it extends suffering over such a long period of time. The 8th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. But courts have consistently upheld life without parole as constitutional. They focus on whether the sentence is proportional to the crime, not on whether the conditions of that sentence constitute torture. But if you spend decades in solitary confinement, if you watch your mental health deteriorate, if you lose all connection to the outside world, is that not a form of torture? As of December 2025, Kendrick Morris is in his early 30s. He has been in prison for 14 years. He has already served more than 2 decades of his life behind bars if you count from his arrest. He has a sentencing review coming up in 2031, just 6 years away. But all indicators suggest that review will result in nothing. He will be denied, and he will have to face the full reality that he will never leave prison alive. The judge made it clear. The prosecutors made it clear. The victim's family made it clear. Morris should never be free. So he sits in his cell day after day, year after year, knowing that this is his life now. This is all his life will ever be, until the day he dies. So I ask you again, is this more humane than the death penalty? Is 50 years of this really better than execution? Many of you will say yes, he deserves every second of suffering for what he did to Queen Afu. And I understand that perspective. What he did was evil and Queena and her family deserve justice. But others will look at this and question whether any human being, regardless of their crimes, should be subjected to decades of psychological torture. Whether this kind of punishment serves any real purpose beyond satisfying our desire for revenge. There are no easy answers here. This is one of those cases that forces us to confront our own beliefs about justice, mercy, and what it means to be human. What I can tell you is this. After researching this case and understanding what life in maximum security actually means, I have a very different view of life imprisonment. It is not the merciful alternative we pretend it is. It is a prolonged process of mental and emotional breakdown. So comment below. After hearing all of this, do you think life imprisonment is actually more humane than the death penalty? Or is it worse? Has your perspective changed? Kendrick Morris will face his sentencing review in 2031. We will see then whether the justice system believes he deserves any chance at redemption. But based on everything we know, that day will likely bring him nothing but the confirmation of what he already knows. He will die in prison. The only question is how many more decades of suffering he will endure before that day comes. This is the reality of life without parole. This is what it actually means. And you have to decide for yourself whether this is justice or whether this is something darker.